Hello again, friends. Dan Alasso with Making History. And lately I've been listening to Lex Fridman, who is an artificial intelligence researcher associated with MIT. And he does long-form interviews like Joe Rogan, but his core group of interview subjects tend to be scientists rather than comedians or MMA folks or things like that. One of the interviews that I listened to a couple of days ago was with Sarah Imari Walker, and it was really smart and really fun. So I've been really appreciating this series. Lex has an attitude toward people and knowledge that is kind of similar to Joe Rogan's. As an interviewer, he seems to want to give his subjects space to voice their opinions and to present their points of view and their ideas. And I'm all for this because I do think that it is super valuable to try to understand the perspectives of other thoughtful people, even when I disagree with them. Now, Lex recently posted a short YouTube video in which he responded to some criticisms, apparently by Joe Rogan, of his difficulty pushing back sometimes. And he mentions that Rogan's technique is to say something like, whoa, stop. Did you just say what you said? To make sure that he understood and to get the subject to clarify and expand on their point. Lex makes the important point that, in his words, sometimes really big, negative, or difficult ideas could be said in a quick aside in a sentence, like it's nothing, but it could be everything. And you want to make sure to catch that and talk about it. And not as a gotcha, but to reveal something profound. Now, I couldn't agree more. It's often the things that a person doesn't quite say or that mentions as kind of a given in an argument that are the most revealing about where they're coming from and what assumptions and maybe even biases are baked into their worldview. Now, just hours after listening to that, I saw an example of it play out in an interview that Lex did with the historian Niall Ferguson. Now, Ferguson is not a scientist. So I sort of feel that Lex can't be blamed for not being entirely able to push back on some of the things that Ferguson said that did betray significant biases. But as a historian, I feel that I ought to do that. So the first half of the 2.5-hour interview focused on the new University of Austin, of which both Ferguson and Fridman are founding members. I think Ferguson is a board member and Fridman's an advisor. The university is designed, Ferguson says, to address the failures of higher education globally today. Now, I'm in higher education, and I'm totally on board with the idea that it needs fixing. There are tons of things wrong with colleges and universities today, so I appreciate any attempt to seriously deal with them. Unfortunately, the issue that Ferguson seems to be most focused on fixing is wokeness. Most of the time he devotes to describing the problems of higher ed to Lex. He's not talking about the insane amounts of debt that students accumulate in order to get an education. He's not talking about the lack of clear connections between many academic programs and the things that students are actually going to end up doing in their lives and careers. And he's certainly not talking about the inequity of access and the differences in academic retention and success. He's very concerned, however, that some people have had their campus talks shut down and have been disinvited to campus events due to student protests, and that a few faculty have lost their jobs over political issues. Now, I don't think anybody should be denied tenure or not hired, much less fired, because of their political positions. I do think that it's a little bit ironic that Ferguson is a senior fellow at the Hoover Institution and that a big funder of the University of Austin is the American Enterprise Institute, and that Ferguson himself has publicized his position in opinion pieces like one titled, "I'm helping to start a new college because higher ed is broken," in Bloomberg. When he says in this article that one of the big problems is corruption and racial discrimination in admissions, I suspect that what he means is that there are too many minorities being admitted. Of course, Ferguson doesn't come out and say this in his discussion with Lex Fridman, probably because that's an issue which resonates better with Bloomberg readers than with Lex's viewers. But he does kind of wax poetic about how people who don't learn the classics of European literature can't really consider themselves grown up, or perhaps even fully human. Ferguson then makes an aside, which illustrates the point that Lex made in his other video. About 1 hour, 42 minutes, 36 seconds into the interview, when Lex is asking him about his recent book, Doom, The Politics of Catastrophe, Ferguson says, as far as we can see, the bubonic plague was history's worst pandemic. The mortality was 30%, in some places 50%. This is not untrue, but is this the disaster that most shook the human spirit, which was the question that Lex had asked? I'd argue that the Columbian Exchange, the series of pandemics that swept through the Americas in the 16th and 17th centuries after European contact, was much worse. From a starting population of probably at least 65 million people, 90 to 95% of the natives of the Americas were killed. I think it's worth exploring why this disaster doesn't come to mind when Lex asks Ferguson about disasters that shook the human spirit. Now, I'm not saying that the Black Death was inconsequential. What I am saying is that Ferguson did not say, as far as we can see, the bubonic plague was one of history's worst pandemics. Just as he doesn't say that people in India or China can become grown up by reading the classics of Indian or Chinese literature. This may seem like a little thing, but I think it's actually kind of big. It suggests to me that this University of Austin project isn't about openness or avoiding the types of prejudice that sometimes express themselves as really insufferable wokeness. I agree. But it suggests to me that its leaders are explicitly choosing the European tradition and arguing not only that learning the canonical classics of Western civilization will improve students' minds, which I agree it will, but that only the European tradition will do that, and the rest of the world has nothing to contribute. And this isn't just a rejection of wokeness, it's deliberately and explicitly anti-woke. Now, to be clear, I respect and I embrace the argument that the great works of Western art and literature and music and science are valuable and ought to be studied. But in supporting study of the humanities in higher ed, I'm not going to claim that only the Western tradition is human. Ferguson also mentions, also as a passing aside, which I think is very telling, that only Western Europe got science right. For a historian, this also seems to be a little bit short-sighted. Where did all the inventions that led to the European Renaissance and the Industrial Revolution come from, Neil? Where did math, astronomy, navigation, and the printing press originate? Because the last few centuries have seen Europeans and their descendants in the Americas on top, do you believe that that will always be the case? That science will end along with the military and economic supremacy of white people? Or art? Or civilization? If that's the case, then we are living in the last days. But of course, that's not the case. It's a bit ironic that Ferguson fancies himself to be a master of counterfactual history, which is speculating about what might have happened if a particular decision had not been taken in the past. And I think that's a very cool pastime, but it's one in which one really has to be aware of one's assumptions. So that was just a little rant about something that was on my mind today. I hope people found that interesting. Thanks very much for watching, and I'll see you again soon.